If we think that we are foreign, alien islands of consciousness in a universe which in itself is basically unconscious, mechanistic, and stupid, then we have to declare war on the universe.
Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. This is a dialogue from 1966 between Esalen co-founder Michael Murphy and philosopher Alan Watts, which is notable for both its superb content and for being one of the only instances I've ever encountered of Michael Murphy conducting an interview himself. But hey, when it's Alan Watts, I guess all bets are off. So first off, who is Alan Watts? He's born in England, but moved to the United States in 1938 to pursue Zen training in New York. Then he attended a theological seminary and he got a master's degree in theology. He became an Episcopal priest in 1945. He left the ministry in 1950, and it was at that point that he moved to California, where he joined the faculty of the American Academy of Asian Studies. And it was during the 1950s that, number one, he got a radio show on KPFA where he begins to talk about Eastern contemplative traditions, and he met Esalen co-founders Dick Price and Michael Murphy, both of whom were kicking around the Bay Area after their stints at Stanford, trying to figure out what the heck they were doing with their lives. It's also widely known that Watts comes to represent this pivotal figure in the transmission of Eastern philosophical traditions to Western intellectual discourse. So by the time this conversation rolls around in 1966, Watts had long since established himself as a rather famous interpreter of Zen Buddhism, Taoism, and Hindu metaphysics for American audiences. So we're talking the Beats, the early hippies, young people, intellectuals. They were all fascinated by Zen and the I Ching and Buddhism. And at Esalen, where Alan Watts taught from the very first days in 1962 up until his death in 1973, he really found an ideal context for exploring the synthesis between those Eastern contemplative traditions and this Western psychological inquiry, which was coming to the forefront, especially at places like Esalen. This conversation that Murphy and Watts have occurs at a moment of considerable social upheaval. Obviously, you've got an escalation of American involvement in Vietnam. You've got the Johnson presidency becoming increasingly unpopular because of that. Got the emergence of several countercultural movements, including the civil rights movement, and this more or less new hippie psychedelic culture, right? So there's this widespread questioning of established institutional authority. And it's within this milieu that Watts and Murphy examine fundamental questions about human consciousness and the peculiarities of American cultural expression. And of course, it's all delivered in that $1 million voice by Mr. Alan Watts. This guy could read a Denny's menu and make it sound profound. So here's Alan Watts, interviewed by Michael Murphy in 1966.
So far, most people think about the success of a biological species as in terms of the length of time for which it survives. And so from this point of view, an ant is an enormously successful, non-historical animal that goes on and on and on, repeating the same pattern again and again. Now, this might be something towards which human beings could aspire, but the way most of us are at present constructed, we would find this appallingly dull. And therefore, when some kinds of scientists or philosophers say that survival is the prime criterion of value, there is the opposite point of view. The criterion of value does involve survival because, of course, you have to live and go on living to do anything at all. But that superimposed on that, there must be surviving in a certain way. Now, you know that T.S. Eliot suggested at the end of The Wasteland that this is the way the world ends, not with a bang but a whimper. And Chesterton once said, "You may go off with a whimper, but we will go off with a bang." Because there are those people who would rather be a big flash and a great significant explosion than eke life out sensibly and providently and in a really rather miserly way, so that it lasts a long, long time. I mean, if you've got some butter in the refrigerator, and what are you going to do if you're rather poor? Are you going to put a big, nice glob of butter on a piece of bread and have it? Or are you going to scrape a little bit off each day and put it over the bread so that you hardly notice it's there? See? Now that's the important question. So in a way you could say that the dinosaur was an enormous and fantastic prodigy. Such an enormous thing couldn't last very long, but it was great while it went on. Maybe it was, I don't know. But it's certainly, one could say this of human beings, that we may be a mistake. I could give you all kinds of reasons for saying that the human race is an aberration, is an abnormality, is the most unnatural thing imaginable. But on the other hand, one could also say, but it's the most magnificently unnatural thing. And to have lived in the human race and of the human race, say now in the 20th century, when we are as crazy as we can possibly get, as far as I can see. Nevertheless, this may be the high point in a whole cycle of the cosmic process, and only be repeated again in another 10 to the power of 59 years on some other galaxy.
Do you see man as possibly being in transition to some other, even more fabulous kind of existence as a society?
Well, I do see the possibility of this. Let's go back a little and see what really has happened. Man is a biological phenomenon which has concentrated or specialized on certain ways of developing his consciousness or his awareness. And it seems to me that the thing that marks man out from other types of biological organization, and particularly marks out the human nervous system from other kinds of nervous system, is the capacity of the human being to concentrate on small areas, or shall I say, separated off areas of experience. It's as if we had developed a floodlight, a spotlight, to supplement the floodlight of the more generalized sensitivity of other organisms. That is to say, the faculty of the mind in which human beings have specialized is what we call conscious attention. This is the faculty that we have to use for any kind of literary or scientific pursuit. To read, to write, to play music, especially to read music, to do mathematics, to do architecture, to do engineering. Any kind of pursuit of that kind requires the capacity to concentrate our attention upon segments of experience, and these segments we call things and events. Once you can concentrate on a segment, you can count the segments. You can quantify them. And then begin to have a view of the world that is as if you had taken an ordinary landscape. Say we're sitting here now and we're looking at Mount Tamalpais and the water. And Mount Tamalpais is a fairly wiggly formation. It isn't by any means a triangle sitting up there. But in order to talk about the landscape we're looking at from a scientific point of view, we should have to paste over the window here a huge sheet of cellophane upon which graph paper patterns had been printed. Squares and sub-squares, you see. Then we could number all those squares, and we could describe the landscape beyond in terms of the numbers on the squares. In that way we would have some sort of rigorous, scientifically accurate description of the natural landscape we're looking at. And as you know, once you get things plotted on graph paper, you can start to make extrapolations and predictions of the way a curve will move. And so it is in this way that by a kind of concentrated attention that can analyze the movements and the rhythms of life into little pieces, we have developed the whole of technology. Now, it must be understood that the power to concentrate on segments of life goes hand in hand with an ability to use symbols. That is to say, to use numbers, to use words, or to use, say, musical notation to represent the events and the things which this kind of analytical, dissective concentration can single out in the vast continuum of the experience of our five senses. So this capacity to attend consciously to the details of the world seems to me to be the very distinctive things that the human race has evolved, but at the same time, for all the advantages it has some startling limitations. It might be said to have two limitations, which are quite serious. Number one is that a capacity to see the world in all this separate, analyzed detail prevents you from seeing the other side of the picture, which is the way in which things are related to each other. I mean, it's a famous story that in medicine, specialization goes so far that one kind of surgeon understands only hearts, another only understands throats, another only understands teeth, another only understands brains, and they work upon human beings rather like automobile mechanics. They deal with these particular organs in the human being as if they corresponded to mechanical parts like a distributor or carburetor or whatever it might be. And so they go on fussing around in one place and unaware that their alterations of the human brain or their alterations of the human heart have effects on the stomach or the thyroid gland or whatever. And then they suddenly discover that they're like the sorcerer's apprentice, that they have found a magic to bring about a certain change, but then they can't control the results of this, see? So the great difficulty of analytical thinking, of seeing the world as an amalgamation, a kind of collection of things and events, is that it obscures appreciation of the inseparable interrelatedness of all these things. The second difficulty that arises from this is a natural emergence of the first. In other words, if you start to view the world as a collection of separate things that, as it were, have come together, you are going to be looking at the human being himself as a thing separate from other things. And here you get into very serious trouble. The trouble of the first thing is that you don't see relationships adequately. The trouble of the second is the special instance of this, that you don't see the relationship between man and his natural environment. Now let's take two images. Number one is a barren tree upon which a group of birds have settled. The birds came from somewhere else. They didn't grow on the tree like leaves or fruit. They just settled there. And the characteristically Western and modern view of man's place in nature is, despite everything that has been said about evolution, that man is a stranger in the world and he's settled on it just like birds on a barren tree. The other image would, of course, be the tree with the fruit and the leaves on it that had grown out of it and that really belonged to it. And although from a theoretical point of view, the biological sciences show and the zoological sciences show that we have evolved out of the earth just in the same way as the grass, this is not the practically operative philosophy of man's nature that lies behind the development of Western technology. The practically operative philosophy is that although man may have evolved out of the natural matrix, that he did so by a sheer fluke, that by a sheer fluke he has acquired an intelligence and a set of values and a set of emotions which, because they are fluky, that is to say, might happen only once in God knows how many millions of years, they are therefore something which nature itself does not support, something which is really antagonistic to nature, and that if man is to maintain his identity and his peculiar values, he has got to fight with nature to establish them. This, mind you, is a philosophy which emerged out of the scientific thought of the 19th century. It could equally well have emerged out of the thought of Plato, which is the poles apart from the philosophy of science of the 19th century. Plato is largely responsible for our thinking of man as a spirit imprisoned in matter. The philosophy of science of the 19th century wouldn't acknowledge the existence of any spirit, but they substituted for the word spirit the word fluke, you see? And this will equally well do for the will of God. You see, the will of God, as Christians and Jews conceived it, is pretty arbitrary. God does what he wants to do. And what he does is by definition right. And so suddenly, it says in the Bible, one day the Lord was sort of wandering around and whoops, he created great whales. And, you know, there was really no reason for there being great whales. It was just a feat of imagination that this fantastic fish should arise, or whatever they are. And there you have it. So in the same way, whoops, he suddenly thought up man. Well, that's the same thing, to all intents and purposes, as a fluke. And it has no, what you might call, rational continuity with anything that went before. It was as unpredictable as hiccups. So in this kind of way of looking at things, if you look at man as a fluke or as a kind of evolutionary hiccups, then you've got your image of man arriving on the tree of existence like a bird from a distant place. And he has no real rational relationship to his environment. But all this seems to me to be belied by biological and ecological studies, which show so clearly that man could only exist in the kind of environment that we have. In other words, that an environment which includes a sun and a planet with a moon, with a certain kind of atmosphere, with trees, with a certain kind of cosmic rays and oxygen and condensation of water and so on, that environment is as much a man-growing environment as an apple tree is an apple-growing tree. So that the kind of nature in which we live is human nature, just as an apple tree is an apple tree. If humans grow on this planet, you see, then it's a human planet. And all this idea that that's the pathetic fallacy that we are reading human values into nature which is inhuman. That idea of the pathetic fallacy is based on the assumption that man and nature have nothing to do with each other. If man is a product of nature, then nature is a humaning nature. And you could say, carrying it very far, that you don't find an intelligent organism in an unintelligent environment. You see, ecology shows us more and more that if you describe the behavior of an organism, and you describe it thoroughly, you are very soon describing the behavior of the environment. You can't say what an organism is doing unless at the same time and in the same breath you tell us what the environment is doing. It means nothing to describe the action of a human being walking unless you talk about the space in which he is walking. If you don't talk about the space in which he is walking, all that you're describing is a human being dangling in midair, moving his legs backwards and forwards. But if he's to walk, you've got to describe the relationship of the moving of the legs backwards and forwards to a ground. And so you start to talk about the environment. Now that's the very, very simple illustration of something that becomes far more complex. So that when you get to the end of it, you have to conclude there isn't, on the one hand, the behavior of the human being or of the organism, and on the other hand, the behavior of the environment. They are both the same thing. That is to say, you can replace the old idea of an organism in an environment by a new idea which is that the environment is a field, and that this field operates, and that all actions within the field are the actions of the field. For example, when you have water boiling, the bubbles come up only at certain places. But the bubbles in the boiling water are a property of the whole field. The water is evenly hot, shall we say, all the way through, but the bubbles only emerge at certain places. So in the same way, our environment is equally intelligent all the way through, but the intelligence only emerges, and the activity of intelligence only emerges at certain places where you might say there are cross points of stress of a certain kind, so that intelligence emerges. In the same way, in the field of a science, say the field of physics, talking now with field in the academic sense of the word field, all physicists have a certain amount of knowledge that they share in common, and they keep circulating this knowledge among each other through their journals and articles and so on. And then suddenly, 5 physicists in different parts of the world who don't know each other at all hit upon the same discovery at the same time, in exactly the same way that when the water is ready to boil, a number of sources in the water start producing bubbles at the same time, because the state of the field reaches a critical point at which, shall we say, these discoveries break out. Now, the difficulty is that the analytical, separative way of thinking makes it very hard for people to understand that they themselves individually are functions of a field. If we don't understand that, and if we think instead that we are foreign, alien islands of consciousness in a universe which in itself is basically unconscious, mechanistic, and stupid, then we have to declare war on the universe and fight for our place in it as if we didn't belong. Now that's what we're doing. Western man has an avowed philosophy of the conquest of nature. And in the United States, which is the most, I suppose in some ways, the most technologically advanced country in the world, you see on every side evidence of a spirit of warfare between man and his environment. Here he has one of the most magnificent environments into which human beings ever moved, in terms of natural resources and natural beauty. But what does he do? He behaves as if he had no more brains than a locust. He has devised an engine known as a bulldozer, with which he can push down mountains. He builds in the Hollywood Hills, where I've been staying recently, tract areas that would normally be found somewhere in a valley or a plain. And he slices off great chunks of the hills and makes them flat lots upon which he can erect a conventional ranch house. This so upsets the ecology of the hill and the water streams and the vegetation life that when the next rains come, the parts of the terrace begin to drop down into the valley, and erosion begins, you see, because he hasn't sensibly studied the hill. He hasn't paid respect to the hill, that is, you see. He may think that some African or Asian savage is a stupid fellow because he regards the hill as a god and pays respect to it every morning. But this so-called primitive man is quite correct, that you must pay respect to all natural phenomena, to bodies of water, to lakes, to mountains, to forests, because they and you yourself as a man are what you are as a result of an extremely complicated balance of forces, which is so subtle that it at present time still exceeds the comprehension of man's rational intellect. We would have to work out, perhaps with the aid of computers and all sorts of complex machines for describing very, very intricate networks of relationship. We would have to work out just how it is that the bunch of trees over there manages to stay there. So many factors are involved. Now, but we don't have that respect you see, for something beyond our comprehension. We've got that respect to some extent for our own nervous system. Our neurologists know how little they know about it, and so they treat it with great care. They don't, as it were, rush in where angels fear to tread. But we haven't got the same point of view with regard to the physical environment. And so we go banging it around. We fill our soil with all kinds of chemicals that are caricatures of the chemical constitution of a naturally found nourishing soil. We really don't know what we're doing. I don't want to say this to take the point of view that technology should therefore be abandoned. The point of view is rather that it should proceed with a good deal more respect, a good deal more caution, and in a different spirit, because the spirit is very important. The way you do a thing is in many ways quite as important as what you do. If I want you to pass me the salt at table and I say to you, pass the salt, that has one effect. But if I say to you, would you please be so kind as to pass me the salt, that has another result. And so in the same way, in our approach to animals and forests and geological surroundings, an attitude of, I could even say, loving respect, as if that were our own physical body, an extension of the body. This would be far more productive and creative. It isn't just as if, because it is a fact that the natural environment is continuous with the human body, because that kind of embodying, that kind of organization, which we call man, is something which the total environment is doing. It isn't something from outside that has been put into that environment, as if some mysterious bird from another cosmos had laid human eggs here on Earth, like a cuckoo lays its eggs in another bird's nest. They grow here and belong to it.
There are then emergent qualities occurring always in nature. The evolutionary process tosses up new modes of being. Do you think this is still going on with people?
I suppose it is, because human beings constantly toss up new versions of the good life, so that there is a sort of, in the same way as you might say nature experiments, I would rather say nature plays with different forms of life. Because you see, I don't think that nature is seriously purposive. I think nature is playful. Nature is not under any compulsion to arrive at some goal as if nature were punching clocks in some sort of a business, you see. I think nature is a way of, in the way in which existence, in which being celebrates itself. And this involves an almost infinitely inventive genius for variety. Variety based upon a certain sameness, just as the variety of spokes around the rim of the wheel are based upon the unity of the hub, so that you have colossal variety in nature. But I don't see this variety as constituting a kind of pilgrimage towards some far-off divine event to which all creation moves. I see it far more in the spirit of exuberance. I mean, we all talk about how nature is exuberant, how every tree produces far more seeds than ever will turn into trees. Now, according to your philosophy of economics, you will interpret this. See, if it used to be said that nature produces all these seeds just to be sure that one or two of them will get through. Now, that was based on the ideas of efficiency experts, industrial efficiency experts working in the 19th century, who influenced the philosophy of science accordingly. See? But they never thought of the idea that it might be enormous fun to have all these seeds, even if only a few of them come out. Same with human beings. The Catholic philosophy is that you ought only to have sexual intercourse for the purpose of reproducing the species. Well, they didn't know in the Middle Ages that human semen contained millions of potential human beings, and that even if you only had intercourse once in 18 months with your wife, you would waste millions of human beings. They didn't know that, you see. Now, on the same principle, you could actually have intercourse every night, you see, and have no intention of producing human beings at all, but do it just because it was fun and because it brought you together. So in exactly the same way, you could say all these trees are showering seeds in all directions. Not because this is some engineeringly efficient method of getting a statistically effective number through, you see, but just because it's a great thing to do. I mean, look at the sky. What you could say an enormous number of these stars probably are not like our sun and don't support a solar system. Therefore, they've gone to waste. They're not doing anything. They're not driving anything, you see. Here are all the streams flowing down the mountainside, and here on Tamalpais there are maybe 60 to 70 streams, none of them working a water wheel, and a lot of them just flow into the Pacific Ocean, see? Well, and I can think of in your country, in Big Sur, I can think of all those canyons there where full of flowers and trees and ferns that nobody ever looks at. And you might say, well, they're a total waste. I know a particular valley there where there's a hot waterfall. And that hot waterfall flows and flows and flows, and only very rarely does anybody ever take a shower under it. Now, should it be turned into a public park? Should everybody come and queue up and have the thing enclosed in a box and they all take a shower from it? I mean, that would be awful. The whole thing would be ruined. But just, you see, there are these things that go on in nature, flowers that bloom in valleys unseen by men. They have no use. They are not for reproduction of flowers. They are sheer exuberance. They are just for the hell of it.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Esalen. This episode was produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our theme song is by Nico Holloman. Next week, we'll be back with part 2 of this interview. In terms of editing this tape, I pretty much left it alone, apart from getting rid of some obvious audio glitches and long pauses. I do try to take the pauses out. I composed the introduction to this podcast in collaboration with Claude, a large language model. Until next time, be well.